Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good day. It's about time. My name is Matthias Metke from the RIU, the World Road Transport Organization, based here in Geneva. It's a great pleasure not to see all of you, but I'm aware of you being in the call or on the call. And before we kick off, a couple of housekeeping rules, because we have a large crowd, about 150 people on the line. So we need to make you aware that this event will be recorded. The link will be made available to all of you afterwards. All of you will be automatically muted to avoid any background noise. If you have a question or a comment, because this is an interactive discussion, please use the chat box on your right-hand side and click on the chat icon at the bottom of the screen. Your questions and comments will not be visible to the others, but it will be visible to us. And I'm here with my colleague, John Kidd, from our Public Relations Department, who will monitor and keep track of all the comments and questions coming in, and I will bring them up for all of you. This said, I would like to kick off by saying that both goods and passenger transport services are of course fundamental to economies and communities everywhere. And this is also underpinned by the fact that our industry stands for up to 5% of the nominal GDP worldwide, and 6% of all employees worldwide work in road transport. During the confinement period, revenues declined and operations dropped by up to 50%. Transport operations such as transport of automotive parts, clothing, flowers, construction materials have been decimated, in many cases completely. Empty running has increased by 40%. New contracts have declined by up to 90%. These alarming figures, ladies and gentlemen, have encouraged the RIU to undertake some in-depth research with the industry and our membership, which actually showed that so far the impact globally on our industry is in the dimension of over 550 billion euros. This said, annually speaking, the impact will translate in about 20% revenue loss in 2020. And that's pretty much the same globally, stretching from China over Middle East, Europe to the Americas. RIU has put out a recovery plan, including financial and non-financial measures, in April. Our research also shows that very little to nothing has happened since, and governments need to step up. Quite interestingly, our industry also reported that governments have put up more obstacles than facilitation measures during the pandemic. Now, we have some very interesting speakers joining us today, including two speakers from the industry who represent, let me say, our heroes on the road, and also someone from the European Commission representing the Directorate for Mobility and Transport. Before I hand over to our speakers, I would like to remind you of the housekeeping rules and put up a vote for you first, because I would really like to test and engage with all of you in terms of how do you feel. The question is coming up right now. When you think of the next couple of months towards the end of the year, the next 6 months, how do you feel? Are you very optimistic? Are you optimistic, neutral, pessimistic, or even very pessimistic? So I would really like to hear from all of you now. The question is up. You can vote by clicking, and it's running now for 20 seconds. I let you vote. Waiting for the results to come in. So I will close the poll in 3, 2, 1, close. So now we have to wait for the results, which are, ladies and gentlemen, you're overall pessimistic. 30% of you voted pessimistic. Quite interestingly, 14% of you voted optimistic. On the extreme side, very optimistic or very pessimistic, the votes have been fairly low, and there is a little bit in the middle that remains neutral. So this is enough food for thought, and I would like to hand over to our first speaker and introduce to Santiago Mariscal. Santiago, you're the Global Director at Grupo CC, and you've spent over 30 years in logistics. I think Grupo CC has over 3,000 trucks in 16 countries on 4 different continents. And some of your key customers include, for example, vehicle manufacturing, but of course your customer base is very diversified. So Santiago, over to you. How did you cope with the situation? And maybe you can also share how you voted. Over to you.
Good morning, Matthias. First of all, thank you very much for this invitation to participate in this very interesting webinar. I'm quite pessimistic for the end of the year, especially for the new virus outbreak, which we will expect for the next autumn. So what we have lived in the last weeks or months, it's some signal about what we are going to live again at the end of the year. So unfortunately, being very optimistic, because I'm used to be very optimistic, but towards the situation, the economical situation, and especially in our industry, I'm a little bit pessimistic. Especially, as I said before, on the new virus outbreak that we expect in autumn. Well, talking about the figures you just mentioned before about the impacts on incomes, impacts on cancellation on new contracts, and etc. Well, I believe anybody was ready for this situation. It was an unexpected, completely situation in our industry, not only in our industry, but in general, but especially in our industry, was very unexpected situation. The only positive things, if I may, is that the society at the end, they realized that tracking is a basic service. Without tracking, we cannot refill the stores. We cannot do a lot of things that we have been done in this pandemic. But saying that, also, we are not recognized from the authorities as a basic service. So we don't have any kind of allowances. We don't have any kind of help from the authorities. I can mention national governments or even from the EU. We don't have any help or any support in a certain things. So I believe we need to sit down together around the table with authorities and try to build up a plan and how to help the hauliers, how to help the professionals in our industry in order to make front in the new pandemic, and also to have the right basis for the next future, and how to cooperate much better, and how to be present in the market, and to make the transport at least profitable in a certain way, because otherwise in the next 1-2 years we will see how a lot of hauliers will disappear from the market, unfortunately. That's our vision. Also, if we talk about technology and innovation, in our case, and I'm sure that in all the companies has happened the same, we are innovating since many time ago. We are doing a lot of things in technology, digitalization. We have special equipment in our trucks, as we put smart driving devices in our trucks, which is based in a big data, and we make a lot of things. We implement control tower in our head office to have a real and full transparency and visibility about our truck positions in order to manage much better our capacity. But we are also talking about innovations that for one reason or another, are stopped after our borders. So I'm talking about dual trailer. If you remember, Matthias, in our last meeting, we were talking about dual trailer. Dual trailer, I think it's one of the best innovations that we are running. We are testing in Spain, but unfortunately, we cannot go after the border, the Spanish borders, because authorities doesn't allow to run dual trailers in their highways. It should be a very positive impact in our highways, in our European highways, in terms of emissions, footprints, and in terms of security, because we will take, or at least we will save half of the trucks running on certain routes, right? And apart of that, our concern is, as I said you before, is next autumn, how protect the industry, how to deal in the market. You know that for the haulers, the base stone in our businesses are the right volume balance in terms of loads, which was destroyed from one day to another with the pandemic. You know that to build a right balance of flows takes time, and all the time you have been investing in efforts and in efforts to get the right balance, the right balance. It was destroyed from Monday to Tuesday, let's say, and now we are in the middle of a fight that every day our operators so needs to think about how to avoid the empty kilometers, how to avoid to stop the trucks for 1, 2, or even 3 days, etc., etc. So it's not an easy situation, and well, we would like to see more, let's say, support from the authorities, let's say.
Thank you very much, Santiago. I'm sure Elisabeth Werner, further down the road, I will not ask her to intervene yet. We will hear from your colleague in order to complete our picture on the industry side. But I would just like to pick up a few things that you said, Santiago. You actually said you're very pessimistic, and I do know that this means something because you are a very optimistic person indeed. So that said, you said it was unexpected what happened. And on the positive side, you said people realize that trucking is a basic service. You also said we need help, and you don't see help at the moment. I wanted to ask you a very specific question, Santiago, because you mentioned smart driving and all the investments in innovation that should be done, but I'm sure that you do as Grupo CC already every day. Has coronavirus and this situation slowed down your investment in innovation? Is there something that you can say on this?
No, exactly, Matthias. Of course, we have reduced a lot of investments due to the situation, but one of the fields that we don't expect to reduce our investment is in innovation, because innovation should be key to develop business in the next future. So despite of Corona, we need to still keep investing in innovation. But of course, we reduce in other fields, unfortunately, but not in innovation.
Thank you, Santiago. I think what's interesting for our audience as well to know, I'm sure they know, most of our audience will know Grupo CC and Santiago Mariscal even in person. But I think what's interesting about Grupo CC is you're a forwarder and you're at the same time a trucking company. And you are working with other hauliers in terms of subcontracting. Correct me if I'm wrong, Santiago. And that's why it will be particularly interesting to also hear from another perspective. And you can come back in, Santiago, at any time later in the discussion. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to the second hero representative, let me put it that way, and that is Chef Böckestein. Chef is Director Operations at Böckestein Transport. And Böckestein has about 500 trucks on the road in all of Europe. Also, like Grupo CC, a quite diversified customer base, including pharma, healthcare, but also high-value goods or even fashion. So I'm very curious to hear our second perspective, and would actually like to hand over to Chef, if you can hear me, Chef, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for the introduction and the opportunity to speak here today. I think indeed what you mentioned yourself is the huge decrease in orders, in revenue, which all of us have experienced. Also, what Santiago managed from one day to another, we really went into a huge problem, let's say, with correcting and balancing our network. But there is one other thing I would like, let's say, to put a focus on really from a trucking perspective today. And that's also getting the right people in the right place. Because one thing is your trucks, but the second thing is your driver. And with all the countries and the borders closing, everybody going into a lockdown, especially in the beginning of March, it was really a big problem to get our drivers in the right places in Europe. Besides them having difficulties crossing the border, yeah, imagine all the documents drivers need to have nowadays. Of course, basics like the driving license, but also like code 95, etc. If we look at that with all government offices closed, with schools closed, we are also looking at a mid-term problem with drivers not being able to drive because not having the right documents in these times because they were not able to renew any of them. So that's really something on the consequences we experienced. If we look at the actions we have taken to battle the corona crisis, one of the things we have done as soon as it started, but also continue doing in the future, is really spreading our customer portfolio. And that's looking at, let's say, the mix between basic life products versus luxury projects, but also low and late economic cycle goods versus high and early economic cycle goods. Like, for example, the spread between automotive customers or maybe vegetables, where you understand that the pattern is very different in a crisis like this. One other thing which we really looked at, both with our customers and with our suppliers, is really partnering up with them and looking at how we can support each other to survive this. As you can understand, there are some companies which had a big focus on margin rather than cash flow. Others are focusing more on cash flow than on margin. So somehow finding solutions which maybe are not ideal for anybody, but make both us, the customer, and the suppliers survive this crisis. Last action we had to take, which we disliked the most, but due to the size of the crisis was unavoidable, was to reduce the salary cost. So both to reduce some office staff, eliminate external support, freeze bonuses, and decrease salary cost from up to the board to the drivers, to really make sure that we can survive through a crisis like this. While fighting right now on short term, we also need to look forward. And also one thing you asked me to prepare beforehand on the meeting, Matthias, was to really, let's say, show what can we advise or what can we request from government bodies such as the EU presented by Ms. Werner today, where we are focused on 3 points. The first point is one game changer which is upcoming is the mobility package. It's really something which will require huge investments for, I think, almost all hauliers in Europe. I think right now the market has so much changed that an adaptation on this program and looking at the right time for implementing it would be really something good to do right now. Besides that, it would be good from an EU perspective to align the support on domestic level. What we see now is that some countries in the western part of Europe are focusing very much on support for employees, where in the eastern part of Europe there's more the support towards employers. What can result for internationally active companies that on two sides they somehow miss the support. So they are not eligible for any support anywhere they are operating. Besides aligning the support, what we think would be good is also to avoid the support of highly underperforming companies, in a sense that it's still, let's say, about the survival of the fittest and not about survival by subsidies, in a sense of companies which would anyway face a difficult time to spend all the money on keeping them alive. And after discussing with some of the industry colleagues, the last point I would like to point out today is the uncertainty we are facing of payments of the received delay in payments to government bodies. We were able to postpone some of the payments, but it would be really good to know when exactly it will be due, because now a lot of companies like us are postponing any further investments, not knowing what exactly will come up in liquidity sense. So thank you very much for this, Matteo.
Chef, thank you very much indeed. I would like to also pick up a few points that you raised, and you particularly started highlighting drivers and employees and how coronavirus is impacting also your operations, let's say internally. And I think it's also remarkable that you said that huge investments that you planned to do will maybe be jeopardized. You mentioned the mobility package. Could you allude a little bit more on what you have in mind in terms of huge investments? Are you referring, for example, to retrofitting your trucks for the smart tachograph, or what is behind this? Thank you. Sure.
Yes, so one of the points indeed is retrofitting the tachograph. Another point is balancing the networks to align, let's say, having the trucks in the right locations and making sure the drivers are home in time and have the right facilities around them. We are a big fan of, let's say, applying all this. So we are opposed to stop any, let's say, things to improve towards the future. But what we really look at is, let's say, the right time and to do it in a way what is sustainable for the industry.
Thank you, Chef. Before handing over to Elisabeth, one final question, because you said there's a lot of uncertainty. Have you also voted very pessimistic, like Santiago?
No, I didn't. I voted pessimistic in a sense of, but compared to, let's say, the general outlook in the beginning of the year.
Very good. So I think my follow-up question to you would then be, do you know how your company will look like in a couple of months down the road?
No.
That's very clear. And with this, I would like to actually introduce to our next speaker. Thank you very much, Chef. Both of you, I'm sure, will come back in after our next speaker and the very interesting and highly anticipated intervention of you, Elisabeth. Please allow me just to say a couple of words on you. So Elisabeth Werner is the Director for Land Transport, which basically entails not only road, but also rail, for example, at DG Move at the European Commission, where you've held this position since 2017. But you actually joined the European Commission already in the mid-90s, and you held various positions, including on budget control, and transport and mobility. So you are, in my humble view, the best placed to also take up some of the remarks that our two speakers have brought up. And just to remind you, Santiago kicked off in the beginning saying he doesn't see help also by the EU and anything concrete. But I think you're working on something which is called the Next Generation EU. So I'm very delighted to introduce to you, hand over to you, and we're looking forward to your insights. Elisabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Thank you for the kind introduction. Indeed, I was listening with interest because it's always a good moment to check actually our perceptions from in the institutions in Brussels with what people out there really in the sector, in the field see. And it's not, unfortunately, always the same. And that's why we need this sort of debates today more than ever. When the crisis began back in March, and member state after member state were closing the border, the first priority of the European Commission was to ensure the continuity of freight transport, notably to ensure that medicines, food, water, livestock got to the places where they were needed. This is really the moment where we drastically realized how integrated our economies and our supply chains are, and the value of the internal market, where normally, at least within the Schengen area, borders really don't matter. So very quickly after there were national unilateral measures, all eyes turned on Brussels and on the Commission, and we put forward the Green Lanes concept. And I think that looking back at the evolution in the freight transport sector over the last, say, 3 months, we should recognize that the green lanes concept have fully delivered. Member states were strongly committed to meet the objective of maximum 15 minutes waiting time at borders, and they have removed, perhaps gradually, but they have certainly removed disproportionate, unnecessary measures, and we have argued very strongly against quarantine for drivers, against the use of transit convoys, and we have also managed that truck drivers are recognized as essential transport staff whose mobility, even when everyone else was in lockdown, was recognized as essential. Now, since last week, since the 15th of June, the restrictions are being lifted, where some controls are maintained. They are, to our understanding, no longer systematic, but sample-based. And that certainly helps to ensure the fluidity of traffic. However, we also have been observing and monitoring the situation at all the borders in Europe very closely. And it's clear that some of the EU non-Schengen borders, the situation is not optimal, and certainly also EU external borders consistently suffer from long waiting times. We understand that some of this was already like this before the crisis, but I have to say that at least for me, waking up every morning and first checking the waiting times at the borders was something of an eye-opener. And so this has brought some new knowledge. We have worked very closely with the GSA, the satellite agency. They are developing a Galileo-based application, which helps us to monitor this situation, and that should also be useful to both the drivers and the border guards. But what we want to do now is draw the lesson from the pandemic and see how we can improve the traffic at the borders for the post-COVID period, but also, as Mr. Mariscal has said, how we can really be better prepared in case there is a second wave, which we cannot exclude. We, like you, don't really know what the situation will bring, how it will evolve. None of us has fully understood what is the economic impact. We don't know if it will last. We very much hope for a quick recovery, but there's a lot of uncertainty. I also want to say that drivers really have done a great job during the crisis. We have tried to protect them. We have issued recommendations on that as well, to have protective equipment available, to make sure that resting areas are available, that catering could be found. And we argued against, as I said, quarantines and convoys. But we had a very unusual situation also, and we were working together with the member state to allow a number of derogations, and I want to talk about this as well very briefly. A majority of member states have issued derogations from maximum driving and minimum resting times, and that has created a patchwork across Europe, which was very difficult to control. And by the way, I think controls were very light during that period. So we have a full understanding that some extraordinary measures are necessary, but we also passed a strong message that we want to come back to a situation with a more harmonized approach, and that such exceptions cannot really last for very long. We have also issued some legislation that allows certain licenses, certain certificates to be valid even after their expiry period. Because it was simply impossible to pass some of the tests, to pass some of the training, to have some of the medical checks being done. And we also really saw that it's obvious that some operators have liquidity problems. So on the one hand side, the Commission created a much more flexible state aid framework, which can benefit all the sectors, including road transport. But we also looked in the legislation in particular when it comes to assessing the financial standing of companies for operators to have their licenses, and we extended this to allow this financial standing to be assessed on 12 months instead of the usual 6 months. We also clearly now see that some lessons on the operational side are born, and I'm happy to hear that actually investments in innovation are not being postponed. For us, it's quite clear that we need actually more digitalization, faster changes that are already in the pipeline. This really helps with the controls. It avoids this human interaction. It avoids exchanging papers, which today should no longer be necessary. So we hope it will give a boost to ECMR, for instance. But we also want to see more automation in terminals. We want to see electronic road charging to become the rule, including for vignettes. And we see a lot of opportunities there to get things done that, you know, we wanted to do anyway, but they could be done faster now. Why could they be faster? I think it's because the Commission tabled an unprecedented financial package, which is really huge in numbers, with a number of measures in infrastructure, in greening of the fleets, and in supporting this sustainable and digital transition. This is now under discussion. It is actually very much, I would say, geared towards member states and towards big projects that could also benefit from loans. So I understand that for relatively small operators, it's a bit of a puzzle how you will be able to benefit from this. And we're ready to discuss this with you. But this is something I think we will want to use to the full to modernize also in the sector. A last word I want to have as well, now that we're resuming passenger transport. I know we will mostly focus here on freight, but also passenger transport has been even more affected than freight. And especially when it comes to the cross-border bus and coach services, they have really come to a halt. We want to also provide clarity here. There is a new website that has been launched, the Reopen EU, that contains information for every member state, really what are the conditions for your personal mobility, but also for mobility being offered as a transport service. We need a very quick comeback here. We also strongly support a resumption of all collective and public transport, because as long as there are some border controls, it's clear that having more and more, perhaps more than ever, private cars on the road is going to be a challenge as well to keep the supply chains fluid. So I hope with this I've been able to explain that we have not at all sat back and watched at the developments. We have been trying to help. We've issued a lot of recommendations to the member states. We have created national contact networks. We've had close contacts with industry almost daily, with pharmaceuticals in September. And we have most of all been much more operationally involved in what transport business really means. And there are a couple of lessons learned for this. I hope we'll be able to transpose them to be really better prepared should something happen again. I'll stop here and I look forward to your question.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth. I'm pretty sure that there will be quite a few. And while I let Santiago and Jeff from our logistics representatives side, let them think about their question to you, I just also wanted to pick up on some of the things that you have said, Elisabeth. Let's start with, you said that you are proud of, or let me start first saying you're obviously not proud of the patchwork of rules that has been created in the EU, but you also mentioned a couple of things that you're proud of, including there are more flexible state aid rules. You mentioned innovation as well, and I wanted to pick up on this, ECMR and boosting, automated processes, electronic road user charging. Is the Commission planning or prepared to also put money on the table to support the acceleration of these investments? And I'm particularly curious, and maybe you can add something, because there is a lot of rumors around the next generation EU that the EU is working on at the moment. So what's to be expected? There's big numbers out there and about 750 billion. So what's your take on this, Elisabeth? Is there something we can hope for as industry?
Thank you for the question. Yes, I think okay. The money, there's big numbers circulating, and of course you understand that this was just the Commission's proposal. Now it's with the heads of states to discuss, and the European Parliament will have a word to say. But it's clear that everyone focuses on sustainability on the one hand side and digitalization on the other side as an opportunity to come out of the crisis and transform certain aspects of our society, and transport, and especially road transport, is of course at the core of some of this transformation. So I think you can be pretty sure that there will be investments in sustainable infrastructure, and sustainable infrastructure would mean a lot of alternative fuels, a lot of greening. There is clearly talk and mention in the documents as well about fleet renewal schemes. Can be scrapping, can be bonus, but clearly that's there. And I'm also quite happy that it's actually not limited to cars. It's clearly covering freight, and it's even multimodal. And third, the infrastructure itself, upgrading of infrastructure is seen as an investment into the future. We have made sure that things such as the safe and secure parkings are firmly anchored in there. And we have the digital aspect. For the digital aspect, I think it will be a lot of ITS, it will be a lot of 5G equipment. And there is opportunity, even though it also largely depends on the sector and how you could organize this, that this would inclusively cover as well vehicle upgrades. This is what I see in the package as of today. Of course, it's still under discussion. There is a lot of arguments in the media as well that you will have seen on grants versus loans. I think it really does make sense to look at the loan side as well. We are in constant contact with the European Investment Bank. They are looking at seeing how they will also be able to support individual companies, of course, in an aggregated way. So talk to your national authorities and tell them to make the best of this pot of money that will surely be available regardless of the final figures.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth, indeed, for this additional information. Santiago and Chef, we talked about the global figures, and Elisabeth, our survey, our research has shown, and thank you, by the way, for also highlighting passenger transport. There is certainly more to say on passenger in a separate seminar or webinar. In Europe alone, the economic impact we found was nearly 150 billion. So 750 billion sounds like a lot of money, but I think you're looking at several years. The impact so far was 150, and there are major investments, as also Chef and Santiago have outlined, that need to be done. So Santiago, Chef, who first? Maybe Santiago. How confident are you now after Elisabeth's intervention / promise that there is some support coming?
Well, I'm really happy to. Well, first of all, Elisabeth, thanks for your words, and thanks for your good words on the support, on the next coming support to our industry. But I have a question, if I may. E-commerce is very important. E-toll is very important for France or for any other country. But do you really believe now is the time to still focusing our efforts in investing in these features? I mean, we can have e-seminar, we can have e-tolls, we can have all the things that you have mentioned before. But what happens if the next year there are not hauliers in Europe to use this e-seminar or these e-tolls that we are focusing our efforts now to develop? So maybe we can focus more efforts into help really the hauliers that are running in Europe, covering the basics. And because as you said before, we made a very good job at the beginning of the pandemic, securing the basics into the stores, vegetables, water. But who really paid that? From my point of view, it was our industry who paid for these basics, not the governments. And we are honored to do that. And we will do it again, for sure, because we are human beings and we are here not just for make business, but also for helping the people when it's needed. But do you really that it's time now to focus in these things, our efforts, more than to focus in better to get better terminals in our intermodal solutions, or to get better support for the hauliers, or to get better support to have the right drivers, or to have the right documents, as Jeff mentioned before?
You want me to reply right away, Matthias?
Elisabeth, up to you if you would like to reply immediately or collect the question from Chef and combine the two. Up to you.
Well, I can already provide some elements of reply. Actually, there is one thing that I forgot to mention, which is extraordinarily important. I think that's also the European framework called SURE, S-U-R-E, which allows the support to salary payments, where a lot of EU money will go and help combine with national money for companies who have put workers on short-term or on related leave to continue paying them. And that is one of these immediate measures. In my intervention, I was on the one hand side trying to look back and see what we did during the crisis, but clearly our framework for the recovery is looking at over the next couple of years. I haven't replied to the survey. I'm not very pessimistic. Of course, overall, there will be a sharp economic downturn this year. It will affect the road transport sector as it will affect the economy as a whole. We know transport overall is among the worst affected sectors, and I don't want to be blind on this, and I don't want to deny this. Yeah? There is hardship, and we know it. Nevertheless, what we want to do is create a framework overall to come out of the crisis in, say, in a time horizon 22, 23, with a solid structure that is fit for the future. And this is the framework I'm talking about. And this is why I continue to think that digitalization, getting rid of paper document, modernizing terminals, modernizing fleets so that they are greener, is something we want to do. Because that's what we need to do anyway. And instead of doing it in 10 years, if we make a wise use of the money, we can do it in a 5 years horizon. That's why I think it's not irrelevant to look into these opportunities. It's not, I think, contradicting you in your arguments that you have today, tomorrow difficulties because you need to find the loads and you want to avoid empty kilometers. There's several comments in the chat as well about the empty runs. And that gives me the opportunity to come back also to what Chef already said earlier about the mobility package. Mobility package is now in the final phases of adoption. It goes to the European Parliament plenary on the 8th of July. You know that it has been a long struggle. And I think it will be good if it's adopted because it provides some clarity and some certainty and that allows you to prepare for it. Only one piece of it will be immediately applicable and the rest will give you 2 years from now before it enters into force. As the Commission, you know, has issued a statement at the time there was the agreement, we are now carrying out a study that looks in particular at the impact of the return of the truck provision. This study is ongoing and we will ask the contractor to also take into account the COVID-related aspects. We expect the results to be available towards the end of the year and we will look at it really in a completely objective way to see what is really the impact and are any additional measures necessary, including possibly legislative measures. It's actually a good thing that we have this study ongoing, and as much as it will be possible in this short term, we do want to look as well as how the pandemic has affected the sector.
That's very interesting, Elisabeth. Chef, what does that do to you? So a quick feedback from you, please.
as you started the question before, Matthias, with asking if somehow the answer of Elizabeth satisfied me or arguments, I think it was very nice, and perhaps sometimes we forget also the things what are done already, in a sense that at the start of the pandemic and the lockdowns we experienced, I think the record was 4 days at the border with a truck. And the green lanes indeed have brought a big success to that. But as soon as it's running as normal again, we tend to forget that also a bit easily. So in that sense, when she's telling that more things are on the way, it also somehow eases us. However, I would still like to mention that we are also putting a lot of efforts and money on, let's say, changing our company into the new digital world, really trying to digitize as much as possible. But still, every change, either it's mobility package or innovation in other ways, it costs money. So I understand that we are looking at an outlook of 2-3 years fully recovering and then coming out better, let's say, than we went under. However, we should also keep in mind that we should make it this 2 years. So we also need some short-term solutions on that.
So you insist in short-term solutions, Chef, that's very clear. And I would like to pick up on something that you said, Santiago, in the beginning, in terms of using the innovation that's already available. You said dual trailers, higher capacity transport, which is an innovation that you already have available. And you said that the EU should allow cross-border operations. Elisabeth, like very brief, maybe 10 seconds, any hope for us to have the EU opening up on existing innovation like this?
Thank you. Yes, we're interested in everything that allows really to save on CO2 emissions. But you know, you also rightly explained that I have a dual head on. So I'm also dealing with rail transport. And I actually do think that the really heavy and long distance transport should also more be transported by railways. But I'm not at all negative on the high capacity vehicles, because I do see a lot of potential there in saving on fuel and being more energy efficient. And we're absolutely ready to look at this.
Excellent. Thank you, Elisabeth. I know your view, and it's a tricky question, and we could have a separate webinar on multimodal transport and cooperation. I think, as you know, the RIU's view, we believe if you want to make trucks or trucking better, invest and innovate trucking and don't shift mobility or logistics to other modes. But that left aside, and maybe also reminding us, Elisabeth, we have 35 countries on the call, 17 from the EU, so it's truly a global audience. And before I look to John and bring in some of the feedback that we have received, how come, Elisabeth, and I know that's a little bit a cheeky question, but how come that the EU is not as positive towards our industry, road transport and trucking, like other parts of the world, for example, in the Americas and China, where we also see that governments are more keen and faster on the uptake to support our industry? Why not more positive towards trucking?
Look, Matthias, I'm not sure I even grasped the question. We are positive about trucking in the sense that we fully recognize how essential it is for ensuring the way our economy works, the way our supply chains are integrated to make sure our supermarket shelves are filled. That's why we tried to act fast and decisively when the crisis hit and the borders closed down. The one thing that the EU budget does not do, and I suppose that's behind your question, is award direct support to companies when they're facing liquidity struggles. That is something that we don't do grants to individual companies. We support the infrastructure, we support the systemic change, and we provide a lot of flexibility for member states, for national schemes that can benefit the companies. And you cannot compare an European integrated structure, joint institution with a national budget in that regard.
Thank you, Elizabeth. No, that was indeed an intended question to also prevent that applications from the industry land on your desk tomorrow. So that was a useful update. But I do believe it's interesting that you work as the European Commission on this resilience fund and the Next Generation EU. And I just wanted to check with John. What has our audience flagged to you in terms of questions?
So it's here dozens and dozens of questions and comments, a lot on dual trailers and high capacity vehicles and why the EU is not more pushy if what Elizabeth says is kind of the general consensus in the EU.
Elizabeth promised she would work on this.
Exactly. So we have noted that. Maybe I'll group a few questions to the operators and then a few for Elizabeth. So for the operators, I think we've already discussed green lanes from, I think Santiago, you talked about that, or Chef. But maybe one question that's come up a couple of times is, in your view, in the countries you operate in, which countries are offering the best support at the moment and why? And then there's a couple of questions following on in that same vein on liquidity in particular, and Elizabeth just mentioned liquidity. So maybe that is a question. And then a second question on empty running. And from an operator perspective at the moment, what are your solutions in terms of empty running, empty trips? And what help, is there any help needed or available, or what are the options for help from governments to help with that? Because the market won't pay for empty running.
Shall we take that questions quickly? Yeah, there was empty running. That's more for Santiago and Chef, how you tackle this, and the liquidity issue.
Yeah, and best countries at the moment. What do you see?
Yeah.
Which countries are doing best at supporting the industry?
That's a good one. And I may add, is the EU, are we willing to learn from best practice? But,
can I complement this? I'm really interested in what could be done to reduce empty runs. And do you think there's anything that the European framework could do to help in that regard?
Gentlemen, that's to Santiago and Chef, if you may want to respond to this. Who comes first? Santiago?
Now you can hear me? Okay. Well, what we can make to reduce the empty kilometers. So if I have the question now, is like I have discovered the golden chicken, because it's a question that a lot of hauliers we had during the past century, let's say. Of course, as I said before, balance our flows is a key to reduce the empty runs. So now, as long as the industry is recovering, we can recover a little bit our balance, and we can reduce our empty runs. But of course, technology is a must. So you need technology in our company, I mean in the companies, in order to have a full visibility about where is your fleet, a good align with the sales team to get the contracts on the right places, and then you can reduce the empty runs. But in the crisis that we have now, to reduce the empty runs is just every day sit with the operators, see where we have the backlogs, if there is any, and then to try to get the closest track. So nowadays, I'm not worried about the empty runs. I'm more worried about the empty trips back to at home. That's our main concern, because empty runs you can make 40, 50 kilometers, which is not bad. But the most concern for us now is the empty trips back to the origin. That's the main concern, more than empty runs.
Very clear. Chef, would you agree to that?
Yeah, fully agree to that. And maybe to come back also on the other question, which country we see having the best support? What we like is that in the western part of Europe, the support is focused on, let's say, helping out the salaries to the employees, but especially that it's not focused on having huge downturns in your turnover. Where I think, yeah, as you said, of course, the turnovers are decreasing. However, in some markets, it's still ongoing. And because of the empty runs, etc. In the transport market, you won't see a decrease in your company, maybe of 50–60% in all cases. But because you are operating in an industry with maybe a 1 to 2% profit margin, even a 5 or 10% decrease in your revenue can already, let's say, kill your company. So let's say that are the kind of the support programs where we see which is not helping the trucking industry a lot. Besides that, maybe one more comment on the ECMR, also towards Ms. Werner, is why I think it's also important to really push this subject now, because now there is added, let's say, another reason to start with it, the health reason because of the physical contact, but also as we are facing a liquidity crisis, we should realize how important the ECMR is for the liquidity, as a lot of shippers are using, let's say, the delay in documentation to uphold their payments. So when everything is digitalized, also the payments would be much faster, and it would help, let's say, the trucking companies in the end of the supply chain to keep their company going.
Thank you very much, Chef. That was a complete answer, I think, to the points that you flagged, John. Thank you very much again, and to all of you on the line. I would like to, I think our head of office from the Brussels office, Raluca Marian, is also listening to us. I just wanted to pick your brain, Raluca, for a minute, in the sense of, for less than a minute actually, because we are already 55 minutes on the call. What's our view as RIU regards the and our wishes, basically, when it comes to the next generation EU announcement? I think we're working on a statement to the EU to make our demands a bit more clear. Can you come in for a second?
Yes, hello everyone. I would just like to pick up on the next generation discussion that Elizabeth kindly explained the context. And we are aware that there are different lines in the next generation which could support the industry, but everything is very vague and also a little bit confusing, and we are just one of the others. According to our calculations, and given the huge loss that we have experienced and that we are still expecting because of the pandemic, we would need an envelope, not only some vague discussions and references to our industry, which member states can pick up or not, because as you rightly said, it will be mainly the member states making the budgets and taking this money from the EU and allocating it to the industry. So we would need, according to our calculation, at least 10% of this budget, round about 75 billion euros, in order to be able to embrace the future and be part of this industrial revolution, greening and digitalization. We heard also digitalization being mentioned several times today. Just as a very quick remark, it was a little bit shocking to hear yesterday in the Digital Logistics Forum run by the Commission, a very big technology company underestimating the investment that our industry requires in digitalization, and saying that every driver can have an iPhone and an application on the iPhone, so why are we complaining that things are so difficult? So we would like to see more concreteness in the next generation and an envelope for our industry. That's, let's say, the main message that will be in our letter, with a focus on decarbonization, digitalization, and infrastructure.
So, Raluca, we would agree with Elizabeth's view that there should be focus on greening, on decarbonization, on digitalization and infrastructure as the three main pillars. So it's good to agree on something, Elizabeth. We will not put that question forward to you in terms of being able to receive an envelope, because we know and understand that this is currently being discussed on higher levels in the council. And I've just looked up our survey, Raluca, and I've just checked the figures for Europe again. So logistics has been hit by 64 billion. And if I understand correctly, just to give you a benchmark, 64 billion is about what you need if you would want and dream of exchanging all diesel trucks in Europe with battery electric solutions, just to give you a thought. So at the end of the day, 75 billion is maybe not a big ask, but a big step forward for the economy as a whole. So we will engage further on this, Elisabeth, and with leaders around the world. We have already taken 59 minutes of your time. John, if there is not any participant who's jumping up and down from his or her seat to really insist on coming in.
No, but many comments, and so I think, Matthias, we need another webinar or several to deal with all the questions and comments in the future.
I would love that, and I would like to conclude by saying I think there has been a great sense of agreement on more concrete support is needed. We heard that some concrete help will come, but everybody also agreed that more coordination and alignment is absolutely critical right now. I think on behalf of the RIU, I would like to thank you, and I would like to remind everyone not only that trucking is essential and has been is a basic service, but there are also borders, and borders are normal. In the EU, they are maybe not. They are at the external EU border, and I visited some of those. There are substantial waiting time of days. And as long as we are stuck at borders with running trucks for days, I think it's pretty useless to talk about zero emission circular economies. So we have to keep in mind and learn from the border issues. And you know that there are solutions available. We heard many of them, including ECMR. You know that the RIU is managing and operating the only global universal customs facilitation tool called the TIR Convention. And with this, ladies and gentlemen, we remain available for you. We are working for you, the industry, and I would not let you go with a final vote. And it's actually the same from the beginning, and it's coming up now. Same question. Are you very optimistic, neutral, pessimistic, or very pessimistic when it comes looking forward towards the end of the year? And that will give us a little indication. So the vote is up now. I give you a couple of seconds. And I would like to understand if something has changed, which is of course due to Elizabeth's encouraging words. She's already shaking the head. Let's wait for the results, ladies and gentlemen. I think we can close the poll in 3, 2, 1. Let's close. Results are coming up. So there is a little increase in terms of neutrality. I would say there is an increase in terms of pessimism, a slight one. Not much has changed though. 20% of the audience believes that they have to remain pessimistic, 20%, 10% neutral, 14% optimistic. Absolutely no one, Elizabeth, voted very optimistic. No one voted very optimistic. So that encourages us to keep on doing what we're doing. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and good luck to all of you, and regards from the RIU to all of you around the world. Watch out for the next webinars. We will be in touch and share the link and make it available to all of you. With this, I would like to thank you and officially close the call and invite you already for the next webinar. So watch out for news from the RIU. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.